Hello. Thanks for coming to the Agile Development for Digital Agencies panel. I want to give just a brief introduction of where this panel came from. The genesis of this panel came from about the last year and a half or so of conversations with myself and colleagues about some of the struggles and successes they've had introducing Agile methodologies into their organizations. And one thing that came out of that that was very clear was that while the body of knowledge for Agile is vast, the information available specific to implementing those methodologies into creative digital agencies is often hard to come by or non-existent. So this panel is an attempt to start a conversation to share some of that information more broadly across our industry, and hopefully we'll succeed at that. So to introduce myself, my name is Victor Allen. I'm the CTO of Smashing Ideas. I have over 15 years experience in providing technical leadership in creative agencies, though I still consider myself an Agile journeyman. Hopefully I'll learn as much as you do from this panel. With me are Charlie Wilke, Director of Digital Production at Mattel, Lori DeBortoli, Executive Interactive Producer at Weiden and Kennedy, and Tom Fox-Cellars, Program Manager at Razorfish. One final thing before we get started. We won't be doing a formal question and answer period with the microphone. Instead, I encourage you to tweet Smashing Ideas with the Agile Dev tag, and hopefully we'll be integrating your questions in real time. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So first question, let's just go down the row and give us a little bit of information about the extent to which Agile is being implemented in your organizations.
I'm fairly new to Mattel. I've been there about just shy of 4 months now, and it's been interesting. With a lot of our external agencies, we've been pushing to do Agile, especially with our game development. We do a lot of highly engaging activities with gaming, and we found that that's a good in for us. And one of the things we'll talk about a little bit later is how you work on the change management piece of adapting an environment into an Agile environment when they're not really used to it and when they're not really structured for it. And that's been one of the challenges that I've been working on.
So Weiden and Kennedy prides itself on not having a process, but there is processes within that. I kind of don't think that's exactly correct to say we don't have processes. So some of our accounts, especially in interactive production, are working towards the Agile process, and we're really trying to implement it. In some instances, making some things. But overall, it's not something that exists. It's mostly the developers and the producers specifically asking for it because we like it, we think it's a good flow, it's a really good pace of way to work, the work is better, but it doesn't always exist in advertising due to time and budget constraints, but also just how advertising works in general historically, and changing that major waterfall process is a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, very similar to Lori's experience. Is at Razorfish, we're very much, at least in the Portland office, focused on waterfall methodology.
Oh, thanks. Waterfall methodology for the most part, and then we're integrating Agile where it makes sense, and oftentimes kind of developing our own brand of hybrid. So we can kind of get into that a little more in a little bit here. But so we're integrating it more and more, and it really depends on the type of project. To Lori's point, though, we have a lot of traditional advertising people who are reluctant to change. They think the creative is king, and I think we have a long ways to go to try to mitigate how that's perceived within the agency and among our clients.
Laura, you mentioned the developers and producers kind of leading this effort. Is that something that a common experience across the three of you? Who's driving the adoption of Agile?
Yeah, I think in my group, it's been something that's come from me and the production team. As, you know, traditionally it has been a very waterfall business. It's been, let's sit down and plan every minute detail of every single project, and then you get into scope creep, you get into, oh, we should have done this, or oh, we should have done that, but that wasn't in our original giant Bible that we built at the beginning of this project. And it just isn't flexible enough for a lot of the projects. And like you said, we're working on where does Agile fit? Because it's not best for every single project, and it may be right for certain aspects of certain larger projects. And so we're still in that process of figuring out the best way to utilize it. But I think overall, the driver comes from more on the production and technical side, because we can see the benefits more clearly than on, you know, perhaps the client side or the brand side, where they just want to say, hey, when are you going to have this done? When are you going to have this done? When can I see the next step? But what's been really interesting, though, is as we've been doing a few projects in Agile, the fact that they can see prototypes faster has been so much more beneficial than saying, okay, on a piece of paper with a wireframe, here's where we're going, but be able to sit down and say, here's where we are right now, and here are the features that are coming. You really get so much more buy-in, I think, and you get them also more engaged in what features they really want and really need and what they can do. So there's a lot more ability to adapt as you go along, when they say, in our initial meetings we thought we needed these 3 things, but as we look at the flow and look at the process and look at where the sites or games are now, we may need to change that, and it's much easier to do that.
Yeah, that's a great point, Charlie, because a lot of times, especially our clients, are not entirely clear what they want going into a project kickoff. And so that's where showing them iterations of the work is a really cool thing. And I think once they get kind of past the jargon of Agile, I think they really start to see the value.
I would also just say that, like, our strategists, some of our strategists really like Agile too. There are other sort of promoters of that plan. What we've seen is that small groups of like 4 to 6 people, at the end of the day, I really believe that's all it takes to make anything. There's like 4 to 6 people who really own the project, and if you can get a small group of people to completely take ownership of something and allow them to make decisions on their own with reviews if you need to, which at Weiden & Kennedy is very important, obviously, and they will ship it. And I think that is really the biggest takeaway, is small groups.
And Lori, how are you getting creative to buy into it? I always find that they, like, for the most part, they're the toughest kind of internal customer when it comes to Agile implementation.
I think a lot of them, that's been a lot of, I'm thinking of the specific times that it seemed to work the best. And I don't know if anyone would point to that and be like, that was specifically Agile development. But when we worked as a team very fluidly, it was usually because we were with the creatives were really invested in interactive, and they really wanted to make something. And it was just the personalities matched. It was a good working relationship. And that's when we really like started to hum as a team,
Yeah, I've had that same situation. I think where it really worked is when you get an empowered creative person in there early and they're in the process, where it isn't someone where, well, I have to go check with my boss and I have to go check with their boss, and then it slows the whole process down and you get back to having a lot of issues of making sure that you have all the right creatives signed off on. But when you get someone that's empowered, and again, small groups I think are very vital. Even if it's a big project, break it down, have 2 or 3 small groups working on individual pieces of it. But getting that creative buy-in has been difficult in the beginning, when we had an initial structure where there were 2 or 3 layers of creative that we had to go through to get approvals on anything, and then go back to the brand and then come back, and it was just taking a lot of extra time. And when we were able to take a couple of smaller projects and loop creative in early and give them empowerment to make the changes and go through it, and then show our clients, it worked much faster, and they kind of went, oh, that's kind of a cool way of doing it. And it was also a great way to sort of get in that always beta mode, where we don't have to absolutely lock and approve this. We can keep tweaking it, we can keep tweaking it, and they felt more empowered, and I think that really helped them out at the end to really own the project more than just sort of sign off at the beginning, check in, and see the final product.
At Smashing, we've found that Agile really starts to sell itself to creatives when they get into that mode of each sprint working closely with the development team and the production team, so that rather than working in isolation and then handing it off in a more traditional waterfall method, being able to integrate with the day-to-day work of the team that's producing the final project gets all the juices flowing, gets that buy-in as well.
There's a big psychology of change, too, to that, because I think that people who see themselves as traditional creatives, like this is my idea, and now you go and make this idea come true. It's a really different when you're doing Agile, because now it's our idea, and we're making this together. So we're all responsible for how it comes out. And that is a huge departure from that sort of level of, I'm the, whatever your role is in this agency, to what the actual final product is. Your role is very different.
Agile tends to be a bottom-up approach frequently as opposed to a top-down approach, and I think that may be one of the biggest cultural shifts. I don't know if you just mentioned the many layers of creative.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the biggest things. We talked a little bit about change management. It's getting the buy-in to sort of say that this is how we're going to go forward. And there are a lot of people that are resistant to change. Like, no, here's our process. I'm the creative director, and this is what I do, and this is where I step into the process. And there is a bit of fear of change. And I think one of the things that's been helpful at Mattel, I talked about it a little earlier, is that we do a lot of games. And the games are a perfect place to do Agile, because you really get to see those early prototypes. You really get to see if the game works. And yeah, there's not all the pretty colors and all the creative's not there, and it's just bits and pieces of wireframe, little guys bouncing around. But you get to see that it's fun, and you get to play it, and you get to understand that, okay, this mechanic works, and then we can add on the other layers as we go. And you also solve a lot of problems earlier than I think you would if you started just saying, here is our full project, then we're going through it. But in general, getting the buy-in and getting that change management, I think it just starts with baby steps. At least that's the way we've been sort of able to implement it, is pick small projects and get small wins and move on from there. And the buy-in, like you said, it just, once they get in the process and see how it works, I've had a few people and producers that were like, no, I don't want to do this. This is going to be a disaster. How do we know when all our dates are? How do we know we're going to have, specific things? And a lot of that comes from their reporting out to the clients. And internally, we have our brand clients, and then we have our external clients for some of our franchise pieces. But they're saying, well, when do I know how to tell them where we are in the process? How do I show them the milestones? Because we've been working in this way so long. So when you get in this new environment, when you work on smaller projects, there's not as much risk. So they're willing to, okay, I'll try it for this one. We'll see how it goes. And then when they see, oh, yeah, we do get a lot more done. We do get a lot more progress. We can actually show things. And I think that's the real power that I've seen, is that point where you can sit there and you can show them the product much sooner than you can in a waterfall method. And yeah, it's not final. Yeah, it's got lots of things that need issues with it, but you can focus on one little piece of it as you go along, whether it's the UI, whether it's a game mechanic. And when you can focus on those bits and pieces, you get a lot more refinement out of them, I feel. And those people feel empowered again. They say, okay, my input's being taken. I can see these bits and pieces of it as it gets built out. But I think that's how we sort of done buy-in.
So what are the main benefits that you've seen from the Agile projects you've done?
Yeah, I think it really, the main benefit is communication, of course. And we've all been working this way, I think, for a long time. And we hear that from, say, our account people will say things like, we need to parallel path this, or we need to work in tandem, or anything, those kind of buzzwords that are really, essentially an Agile type methodology. I think the really successful people are the ones who can communicate well, and that's true for creative directors as well as the product owners or the project managers or anything like that. It's able to communicate across disciplines and convey like the creative idea to a non-creative person, I think is an important skill to have. And the more successful projects I've seen in Agile, that creative lead is really setting the tone, and that kind of makes its way through the organization of like, hey, Kate, for example, did a great job on this, and you should really take a page out of her book because she knows what's going on with Agile, and is not getting hung up on the fact that she's collaborating rather than just driving through her creative approach.
We have a question from Twitter, and my hip chat just crashed, so let me bring this back. Well, while we're talking about that, while we're waiting for that, you mentioned some of the disconnect between the expectations of external clients, or even if it's internal to Mattel, but external to your team. How are you managing that disconnect between the traditional waterfall deliverables and the internal Agile process?
Yeah, that's been a big part of the change management is getting in early when you sort of do those initial requirements meetings and talking to them and telling them this is how we're going to present back to you, and just laying it on the table saying we're going to come back to you in a few weeks with our first sprint, and here's what it's going to be, here's what we have, to show at this moment. And it's much different than the expectations were before of, okay, we're going to do a wireframe, okay, we're going to get the creative signed off on, okay, and then you're going to come back to us when you have an alpha, then you come back to us with a beta. And just getting them used to being a part of the process more often, and also being able to do more with those meetings because you have actual things to look at and play with and poke around with. So it's been interesting as far as some people, like I said, have been on board with it right away, and other people's were not on board at all, and it was just sort of, this is how we're going to do this project, and here's how we're going to report back to you, and just set those expectations up ahead of time. And it's, in my experience, I don't know if it's the same thing that you guys have had with sort of doing, getting teams that are new into the whole Agile process, especially on the client side, is they're resistant, they question it, they think you're a little bit crazy, they don't see how it's really going to work, they put up a lot of objections, but then when they see it, they really like it, and they really like being involved a lot more, and they also have an opportunity to have a lot more input and change along the way.
Laura, you have external clients, I'm sure you.
Well, yeah, I was going to go back, though, because one thing you asked earlier was what were the benefits of doing this. And one thing I just want to say, like, my favorite benefit is 15-minute meetings, and that's
Absolutely.
it. Like, are you kidding? I mean, that has, like, changed our life, because you have to do your homework. And if people do your homework, the meeting is so much more efficient and faster, and you get this, like, SWAT team feel about your crew, like, oh, okay, cool, everybody's invested, and they own it, and we got this. And that is the best feeling, right? That's like the feeling you always want to have whenever you're working on anything, because that's like, okay, we own this, we have this, we're all in it together. And it's hard otherwise. If you have this, I don't know, for other ways of working, it starts to get a little, I don't know, boring, not as interesting, you're not as invested if you're only needed sometimes. And so the more you're needed, the more you're invested, the more your crew is together. I think that is the most beneficial. It changes the culture a little bit. And as far as working with the external clients, I think that our process of how we make things isn't as self-facing to the clients. So we do, for better or for worse, when we make our processes or non-processes internally, they harm us, So those do get seen to the clients when we have client-scheduled reviews, but they're not as involved in our process internally as much.
I would say one kind of challenge we face at Razorfish is at the statement of work phase. So, traditionally the clients are used to, a waterfall methodology where we know what we're going to build up front. We tell them in the deliverables section of a contract, you're going to get these 10 things. Well, that kind of changes with Agile. It now becomes like, we're going to have a bucket of hours, and we're going to put these disciplines on the work. And we don't know what we're going to give you at the end, because it could be a website, it could be an ad-like object, it could be anything like that. And that's where, especially some of the bigger organizations here in town really get hung up on it, because they say, well, what are we paying for? And it becomes like this big discussion. It's only after we kick off and involve them that they start to see the benefit of it. But it's getting past that first, legally binding contract that they get all hung up on. So that's a challenge, and it becomes like another kind of point for change management for our client engagement team to try to sell in the value of Agile before we get to the part where we're writing a contract.
And that actually feeds in nicely to Gordon Mueller's question, and please forgive me if I've mangled your Twitter handle. Agile prioritizes features knowing they might not be getting in. How do you balance budget and promises to the client? This also, I think, for smashing the benefits that we've seen from using an Agile methodology, is one of the more subtle benefits is, rather than thinking of it in terms of you're getting fewer features, you start off the project with more features than you would have put in a waterfall process. Because in the waterfall process, when you're creating that SOW and you're budgeting it out, you're limiting yourself. You're self-editing to get down to the feature set that you can deliver for a certain budget. Whereas on an Agile process where you're taking that possibility that not every feature you talk about initially is going to get in, if you take that risk off the table, suddenly you can be reaching more for, castles in the sky level features, and use the prototyping and use the iterations and the prioritization against business value to whittle that down to the pure product that you're working on. And so I hope that, at least from our perspective, answers that question somewhat, in that Agile gives you permission to overpromise up front so that at the end you end up with a superior product at the end, and that turns into that gives you some subtle benefits in terms of the overall quality and the kind of exploratory feel of the project overall.
And to Tom's point, that is a scary thing for the client. I mean, I deal mostly with internal clients, and to show them, here's 20 features, and you may not get all of them, they're like, well, wait a minute, here's my budget, here's what I'm giving you to work on this project. They're so used to, like you said, having that feature set locked, loaded, I'm going to look at, this, on this, and this date, that, it does take a lot of courage on their part to say, okay, I'm going to sign off on this, we're going to hold hands and jump off the cliff together and see how this goes. And that's why I went back to talking about the benefits. We're talking about these small teams, and that's really the way this works best. The one thing that I've noticed that's been a real great benefit is you have a lot more face-to-face communication and a lot less email, just giant loops. You get a lot more done faster within that group if you can sort of shield them from all the rest of everything else that's going on, if they can be dedicated to just that one project, because they are right next to each other. I think that co-location is a huge part of this, and why it works is they can just resolve issues sitting next to each other, rather than, okay, now we've got to schedule a meeting, now we've got to find where everybody is, now we've got to send 20 emails out and go around and around and around, and they just sort of end up solving a lot more problems and coming up with a lot more solutions organically, rather than through a normal process of just literally email after email.
Plus, you can have people test it, because I think that's really key, because we don't know what we're doing. You know what I mean? It's like not everybody's perfect, and you're going at it with the best intentions and the absolute best strategy you can have, and you're trying to figure out, and then you go to show it to someone and you're like, here's this awesome thing that we're in the middle of making, and they use it completely differently than you thought they were going to use it, and that's just how it is. And you're like, okay, well, we didn't intend on that. We can't put that release candidate out in the world right now. And you have the option to change it all, and that's another awesome reason to use Agile development. I mean, do you experience that?
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, yeah, we do experience the same level. It really gets into like, understanding the client's goals and objectives going into a project, and then
right.
and then basing, the release schedule on that. It's pretty tough though, because a lot of times goals change like mid-project, and I think that's where also Agile is a really good methodology for that, because clients change their mind, and sometimes they change without warning, and sometimes it's a 180. So it's just important to be nimble enough to change with them.
Yeah, and you can do A/B testing quickly. So, I mean, we just, even, the time spent on something, we just changed the UX on something, pushed that live, and pretty quickly the experience changed, how long people engaged with it, how long they stayed on it, how they used it, and how they shared it. So that was pretty impressive, I think.
Okay, I'm going to try to roll a couple of questions that just came in together. So Kazoo Rooster asks if there is a typical project workflow, or is every project unique? And DS Pepper asks, when do you integrate focused UI, UX design effort into the Agile dev process? Is Waterfall better for design? So see if we can run with that.
Yeah, I don't know that you say it's better for design. I do think there are certainly projects that Agile is not great for, and I think we're up here, rah, Agile is fantastic. But if you have really large projects that have really, really hardly defined scopes, or have certain features that are absolutely mission critical, that failure is not an option kind of projects, then maybe some bits and pieces of those you can throw Agile on, but those are more projects that are going to be more Agile specific. A lot more tech heavy projects I've been working on lately, some back-end projects that have been, we've looked at both ways and said, for this project it's going to make more sense to do Waterfall. But looking at how we integrate creative, I don't think it necessarily affects either way, how you set up creative, I think actually you get more input and you get more out of the creatives in Agile, I've seen at least, because they get the chance to take more swipes at it and get to see those little details, rather than saying, here's our big creative plan, we've got sign off on it, we've got client sign off on it, so just go, and we're all doing this. And when you get farther down the UX path, you might say, well, it's not really working great, but we've got sign off on it, so we're going with it because we have this deadline. Where in Agile, you can get to that point and say, you know what, we all thought this was great, and now that we're actually looking at it as a working piece of software, and it's not so great. So how do we solve that? But you're all right there to work on it. And then you can have, what's also interesting is you have different people come up with different solutions. So you may have, some of the IT folks come in and say, hey, you could try it this way. And some of the UI folks come in and say, hey, maybe here's a solution, we did another project. So you actually get to develop your people a bit more, and they get to spread their wings a little bit more into other facets of the development process, rather than being pigeonholed into just creative or just technical. I've seen an interesting spread of people's skills that way.
I just want to say Kazoo Rooster. That is awesome Twitter handle. But yeah, I think that it's really critical for us to have UI or UX. In our agency, we don't distinguish between IA and UX, really, even though they'll do both. But I think you need to have UX directly with the designer right from the beginning, because I feel like with interactive, there's the line that separates those two things is really gray. And I think you need to know a lot about UX to design an interactive, and a lot about design to know how to do UX. So I think those things go so hand in hand that if they're together, and they should be, and I always say this, you guys should be best friends right from the start, so that you can make something that's really interesting and really usable with all the insight that we can possibly gather ahead of time, and then we'll just change it as we learn more.
Right, and Victor, with the first comment, I think that is kind of feed into like a conversation we might need to have about hybrid and when to integrate Waterfall with an Agile methodology. And I think it makes sense to have, we did this with a calendar that we launched last summer, where we had a Waterfall methodology up front for a few weeks, and then we transitioned that into Agile. And I think that can help solve some of the issues we might have with design, and get the design elements locked down before we kind of move into, iterative type methodologies.
All right, and speaking to DS Pepper's question, the idea that the best way to produce that focused UI UX is completely up front is something that concept doesn't survive one Agile project. Once you've gotten into it and seen how the ability to create prototypes and go through immediate iterations with the developers, you start to realize that the best way to actually focus in on the best experience is to get that experience in front of real users ahead of time. And so while the creative vision might be best formulated up front, the actual execution always benefits, I feel, from that incremental and iterative approach. So we've got quite a few questions here. Ashley Ernst asks, how does this translate to budgets? If you're sprint planning, do you budget per sprint with a cap? And I believe earlier CSS Agogo asked, in Agile, how is scope defined? Do you start with an outline, or is it completely organic? So I think all of those.
Yeah, I don't think it's completely organic, and I think everybody implements Agile differently. I think I'm still sort of in a slightly hybrid mode. We still sit down with a client, and like I said, for me, it's mostly internal clients, and we do a feature set. We do a whole list of here's what they're looking for. We do the whole digital strategy on what is the overall big picture that they're looking for. And then we sort of narrow it down from there as to where we're going to go with the budget. And the budget for us is normally tied to hours. So the way we look at it in Agile is, we figure out this budget's going to give us this many hours think it's going to give us this many features at this size and scope, and then we walk it back from there. But you don't necessarily know, and that's where the scary piece comes in, because you may nail something right away, and then you've got more hours to do more things, or you may struggle with something that's just not quite working, that's a must-have feature, and you end up eating a lot of hours there. So there is a bit of faith they have to take on the budget, whereas in a straight waterfall method, it's like you're putting this dollar against this feature, and you're just going with it.
Yeah, I think scoping is a whole lot easier with Agile, and because it gets into just pure hours and the people you need to do the job. Whereas with Waterfall, you need to like really think about it and say, well, it takes 46 hours to do this and 28 hours to do this. Instead, you're like, oh, I'm going to need 20 people, and they're going to need to be on the project for 4 weeks, and then that's 40 hours a week. So it's just 20 times 4 times 40, and then you're done, and it's somewhat easier. But I think then the challenge is like, how do you sell that in? Because a lot of the clients will be like, wow, that's a lot of money, that's crazy, and you just have to say, well, this is what you're going to get out of it, and you're going to get something beyond what you were hoping to get.
I think that it's always kind of messy to scope a project and to make sure you make something on time and on budget. I'm always like proud when we do it, and we normally do. I think that as far as trying to figure out like the exact project that you're going to make, we usually ask for a small amount of prototype money, proof of concept money, and then try and figure out like, can we actually do that? Was our initial big idea vision really like, you know, it was a cool thought, but does it translate when it's an actual product? And is that something that people will really use? Is it as cool as we think it is? Is it as interesting to play with? Maybe not. How can we make that more interesting? And I think that takes a lot of ideation, and sometimes we don't have that much time. Sometimes we need to make a prototype in a few weeks and try and sell it through quickly. So we'll do that, and then we'll drill down further into Agile, if that makes sense.
I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. Ty Monroe asks, any mini case studies that the panel can share?
I don't have any specific mini case studies that I can share right now. There's a couple things that happened internally that I thought was really great that's died on the vine. And so those aren't public. But yeah, it's like I said, as an agency, we're not doing it for every client, every instance right now. So not yet.
Yeah, I can't talk too much in specifics about projects, but I can talk about various areas where if you're looking at areas to start, again, I would go to gaming, I would go to smaller projects that you can sort of define at least the ballpark that you're playing in, because if you try to do Agile in a gigantic project that has really tight deadlines, you're just asking for trouble, especially with going through a new process. But look at something where you know you can show your work early, that you know you can get people's buy-in early, especially if it's a new project, especially if you're looking at changing the way your agency works or changing the way you're working with clients. And I found that to be a really good way to get into Agile. And like I said, once they do it, a lot of people really like it, but there still will be some people that absolutely reject it. And it's just about working with relationships and working with those people on what their issues are and why it did or did not work for them.
At Smashing, we've actually found, and again, I can't necessarily share specifics on the projects, but we've actually found that the larger projects have benefited more from taking that sprint-based approach. We're finishing off a large site now, and it was one of the pilot projects for doing really a light Agile style where we mostly focused on the sprint methodology, more so than some of the other aspects of Agile. And that's worked really well in terms of being able to get that visibility into the project's progress throughout the whole life of the project, and we've been able to, because of that, we've been able to really maintain a level of urgency for the whole project that the traditional feast or famine of Waterfall tends to lack, where typically at the beginning of the project, your next milestone might be months away, and you don't have that sense of urgency or necessarily visibility into where you're at if you're 2 months into a 3-month milestone. We found with the short sprints, you know, every week there's something that needs to be done. Everybody, the whole team knows what that is, and that gives that low-level sense of urgency throughout the, you know, what can be a year-long project. And you don't have that crunch time at the end, and you also get, you know, months ahead of time that insight into whether the project is on schedule or not. So.
I've noticed you get a lot more out of your people. I think they get much more involved in a project, and I think, you know, I've seen a lot of people who on some projects would, you know, not necessarily be going through the motions, but wouldn't be as invested because they've sort of gone past their piece and they're waiting for the next, you know, train car to come to the station before they can do their next piece. And with Agile, you're so invested with those, like you said, those morning meetings. I mean, they sound really kind of silly. Let's do a 15-minute stand-up meeting every day. Like, okay, don't we already know what we're working on? But they really focus the team on what their task is that day, what they've just done, and what the goals are. And when everybody's very clear on what those goals are, they just power through it. And I've really seen a lot of people go above and beyond on a project just because they're so into that next step is so clear.
Victor, question. On that iteration, did you actually deliver public-facing content or features at every iteration, or there was lots of build-up?
That's actually kind of speaks back to that interface between the presentation to the client and the way the internal team is working. So we, on that project, kept much of that traditional alpha, beta build and so forth, but rather than attempting to create all of the functionality for one deliverable, it became an incremental set of deliverables. So that gets more into the Agile concept of a release plan. So each release might have 4 sprints worth of work in it, and you know, obviously we have multiple QA cycles as well as part of that. So as far as what the client was seeing, they were seeing much larger chunks of functionality than we were planning.
Yeah, and I'd say Charlie made a good point too about the internal satisfaction of the team. I think is really important, because a lot of times creative teams in particular will look at a new project and go, holy crap, this is a huge, how do I even wrap my head around this? And then when you break it down into sprints, it becomes a lot more manageable for the individual. And then when they get through it, they're like, wow, we did this. I can't believe we did this, and the timeline seemed crazy, and the requirements were ambiguous, but we got through it. And that really makes people feel good.
There is like one enormous project that's probably going to take at least a year, possibly 2, that's just starting, and it's full Agile development, and it is awesome. It is really awesome to watch the team work with the client and how they're trying to figure that out. And I'm not on that team, but I wish I was. It's really interesting to see how it's unfolding and how they're planning like so far ahead and how they're working as a very small team. And so I'm always trying to edge my way and I'm like, so tell me more about that information, you know, because I just want to know. But I think in a year from now, when this conference happens again, there'll be people up here be able to tell you, like, we spent the last year on Agile, and this is how it worked. And we'll know more from that.
And I want to make sure we get this one in. Kev Murphy asks, where have you gone wrong with Agile? You've been very rah-rah up to this point.
Yeah, no, I think where we've gone wrong is anticipating more buy-in than that was really there. So having some early meetings and people saying, oh, okay, great, and we find out later that they're like still tied to that water. They still want to see those same deliverables, even though you sat down and had a meeting and said, here's what we're going to show you, here's how this is going to work, here's our new process, where they're not as committed as you thought they were. I think that's been trouble. And also some of the scope creep where they see like, okay, let's try and do 20 extra features and try and get our full list in, because they're used to that, okay, I've paid this much money and I want all my features. And that idea of, well, we're going to get 2 out of these 3 things because that's what we have time for, sort of which one do you want to work on? And some of the triage, they've been like, well, I want everything. It's like, great, then we can add a couple dollars or a couple hours to our project or days. And I think that sort of getting people used to what they're going to see and what the end product is has been a bit of a challenge the first few times out, but I think it's gone pretty well. But I think if you try and, the only other thing I would say is you can't have large teams. You don't want a team of 15 or 17 or 20 people trying to do these sprints. It just doesn't quite work. If you can keep it to 4, 5, 6, I think you get much more out of it. Our
biggest point of failure is that we lose people to other projects. So we have a dedicated team of 4 to 6 people, and then all of a sudden one person gets pulled into something else and is gone, and another person gets pulled into something else. And in your dedicated crew of who you said, like, we are going to make this project, is suddenly not there, especially when it comes time to start. And so that part, I think, is our own undoing. And I think that if we internally made a decision, like, we are going to dedicate this people and they are to see it all the way through every single bit of it, it would change our dynamics. But that is a big cultural shift within, there's 600 people just in our building. So that's a big change of how we work.
Yeah, and to add to that, that's not really an Agile specific problem. That happens even in waterfall projects. And I just think Agile probably magnifies it because people are so like heads down and invested that it doesn't make any sense to pull them off. That's something that I think every agency struggles with, and I don't know how we can deal with that. That's a bigger question, I think, than this panel. But
yeah, Mark Hayden asked, let me find this. Do you find that members of a group can balance multiple projects at once? And we found no, that's not the case.
No.
When you're on an Agile project, you're really committed to it, and particularly if you have a team member working on an Agile project and they get pulled into Waterfall projects, the oil and water mix just exasperates that problem. So that is one issue, is you do have to staff up to handle the amount of projects that you intend to take on.
We're in the oil and water stage.
So going back to things that have gone wrong, it's easy to absorb, kind of take on half of the Agile methodology, this idea that you can always change things, but sometimes you are actually working to a real deadline, and when the client has internalized that concept that they can always make changes at every sprint, and it's the last sprint before deploying, and it's a major feature, that can cause problems. So it's easy to get into that feeling like, oh, we're Agile, we can always adapt, but you do eventually have to lock it down, just like any other project. You get that release set, and so if you kind of still have to maintain control of your projects, even if you are being adaptable.
Yeah, and one of the other tricky things, I do a lot of projects that are sort of both as we're transitioning. So you have some of the people that have worked on, and the client side have worked on the Agile project, suddenly get in Waterfall, and you see all this scope creep start to show up. Like, oh, in your last project, we were able to do all this stuff. Why can't we do it now? It's like, well, it's a different kind of project.
Even our internal, it's not always the clients that want to change things for us. It's like all of a sudden maybe originally if we had a team that sold through the larger concept idea, and then they show up right before launch, and then they're like, oh, we should add? We should add this.
Love that.
No, that was in my original vision. I may have not told you that, but that was my original vision for this the whole time. And that is like, the producers just like, ugh, they just die,
I just saw some producers high five.
Yeah, it's like a whole crew of them. But it's like, it's so painful because you have, from a producer standpoint, you of course want to make your CDs happy. You of course want the product to be amazing. It may be the most brilliant idea, and like, how could we not have thought about that from the beginning? But you have a product being released in a week, and you need to push all of this content out there with it, and it has to go through DoubleClick or whatever it needs to. There's a lot of things that have to go through. So being strong in running your team is always going to be, even if it's a team without a leader, even as a team as a whole, I think you can approach that person who's coming with all these new ideas and be like, as a team, we have worked really hard to get to this point. This is everything we've went through. We won't be able to implement those at this time. However, maybe we could do another push later. So you have to negotiate.
We're getting into our final minutes here, so I want to get one best piece of advice from each of you in terms of if some folks out there want to get started with implementing Agile in their organizations, or they're working on it now. What can you tell them?
I would say just be flexible with it. Don't be going into it thinking it's going to solve everything, because I think we've mentioned a number of times that there's sometimes projects that don't work in the Agile methodology. And I would say some of those traditional digital creative jobs, such as banner ads, they don't work in this methodology. So you just can't force things into it. You have to be flexible and just kind of go with it a little bit.
I would say just try it. Like, it doesn't matter if you fail. Like, at least try it and show up and be accountable and be with your team and see how you can actually make something. You know, I mean, when that, I guess it's, I don't remember the exact saying, but 80% is just showing up. I mean, that is really the key. Like, if people think they can count on you and know they can count on you, then you can make anything, and it doesn't matter if you fail.
Yeah, I think also be flexible. I mean, there's a million books out there and a million things you can read about. Here's the exact Agile process. And what I've learned is there isn't really one exact process that works right for you. There are a lot of different projects that are hybrid. There are a lot of different projects that are pure Agile, and some are just certain segments of a larger project. So I think one of the big things is to experiment and see what works best in your environment.
For my part, I think knowing what the benefits of Agile you expect to get out of the process is very important, because there's, as you say, there's so many different aspects to it. There's so many different combinations that if you go into the process knowing, you know, what we expect to get is better communication, or we want to be able to plan more flexibly, or we want more visibility into the status of the project. Knowing, you know, which of those things you really want most will let you know which aspects to try out first, and do a pilot program. Actually have that small dedicated team where everybody's on board and everybody has the buy-in, because, you know, they'll then become your evangelists. Mm-hmm. You know, that success will breed success out in the rest of your organization.
Yeah, and if you try that and not everybody buys in and you're like, oh man, what a bummer, just keep doing it, you know, keep failing.
Fail early.
Fail harder.
Okay, any final remarks? Any questions people want to shout out? All right. Oh, one more.
You hear a lot about analytics and Agile processes and sort of measuring before and after and kind of proving through. And you guys didn't mention that. Is it just because data isn't sexy, or has that been a part of your processes, much measurement of before and after?
I love analytics. I do. I think it's really interesting. You know, it's interesting to know that you can change one thing and people use it differently. I mean, that's amazing to find that out. So, you know, we try and get as much as that as we possibly can. I think we could do a lot better there. We have, I think, 1 or 2 people that do analytics internally, and then I rely really heavily on our media vendors to tell us more information, our media partners. But to me, that's really interesting.
Yeah, and user testing is a big part of what we do, and we do it all throughout the process as well. We try to bring people in early, even if it's just a small group of our internal people, then we do it externally. With larger projects, we'll hire companies to come on and do full user testing with full data and full reports. I think it depends on the scope and the budget, but we try to do as much as we can, because, you know, the more data we can get helps us, especially on all our future projects, and communicating out to the rest of the group on, hey, we tried this in this project, and here were the issues, and here's what worked, and here's what didn't. But to have that data to back it up is so much better than to say, well, we think it's great, or we think it didn't work. But in general, you know, one of the things we try to do at Mattel for all of our projects is just, I mean, we have so much data on all of what we do, but it's tricky because of all the you know, a lot of what we do is for kids under 13, so we have, you know, all the COPA issues, so we don't necessarily have username, login, and, you know, all the information that a lot of, you know, other sites have. So we do a lot of external research, so we try to figure out, here's who's using it, here's how we think they're using it, and then we do a lot of testing as we go through.
Was your questions more about the internal analytics, the burn down charts, and so forth, or
even analytics of success? How do you measure the success of a sprint?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think we do, like we said, we do the burn down charts. We have our list. How many do we get through? I mean, you have all that data of like, how many are we getting through? Okay, we're planning this many hours. Okay, are we on track with our hours? We thought this sprint would take this many hours, and oh my God, we're nowhere near where we thought we were. We didn't get as many done as we thought we would. So yeah, we track all of that for all of our projects, and then we go back and we see, okay, let's go back and re-estimate our next project. We think it's going to be, you know, twice as many hours because it took us longer, or is that because we didn't have the right people on the right project, or the right resources? And
we didn't touch so much on the panel about the tooling and estimation process, but when I say that you need the buy-in from the team, there's a lot asked of the individual members of the team, because we're tracking everything that they do. So, you know, that buy-in is the price for the level of autonomy that an Agile team gets.
Yeah, it was funny that just the tracking hours, like some of my team was like, why do you want to know what I do all day? Like, you know, this will actually help you in the long run.
Yep.
But that was kind of interesting because they're like, so we can tell what you do, and so next time we put you on a project, we know it really takes this many hours, and we're not overtaxing you, and if we are overtaxing you, we know that we need to get more people in. And once they sort of realize why we're tracking all these hours and how we can go in the postmortem and sit down and say, listen, here was our original estimate, here's what our actuals were, and what do we have to do for our next project?
Okay. I think that about wraps it up. I want to thank everybody that submitted a question. I know we didn't get to everything. At some point, we're going to be posting a wiki specifically to follow up and continue this conversation. I'll try to get every question that came in answered somehow. And thanks for sticking it out for the panel. And I think we're going to hang out a little bit afterwards. So feel free to come up and talk to us. Thanks.